We're now joined on the broadcast by Porsche Factory driver, the lone American in the setup, and a man who's won just about anything that you'd want to win in endurance racing. Patrick Long is with us, and Patrick, welcome to the broadcast.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Now, we've had the chance to talk to some of the other Porsche Factory drivers over the past few weeks, and we've gotten different takes, different perspectives on how sim racing can be used as a tool to help their career. Before we got to talking, I got the chance to see your rig and your setup in your shop, and it's a pretty serious deal. So clearly, it plays a big part in the way you train and prepare for races. How do you use sim racing to help you prepare for the real life thing in a general sense?
I'll tell you what, that answer is evolving by the day. This situation that we find ourselves in, where we're all stuck at home and away from the racetrack, I've been introduced to professional esports, and just like anything in life, when you go to a pro level of something, you realize that there's a whole nother world of equipment, there's a whole nother world of talent, set of objectives, and so it's been eye-opening. But up until the situation that we're in here this month, it was used for off-season mental focus and exercise. A lot of the real-world online racing really projects you into that same mindset. And so I've found a lot of solstice in that. Haven't been active for the last few years because I had a couple of kids, but this has thrust me right back into the action and justified me spending time away from the family in a different fashion. But coaching and learning racetracks would be two other parts of it up until now. And all of a sudden we're into full testing, product development with hardware, software, full simulation, data acquisition. I mean, it's just like racing as a factory driver we're now doing in esports.
I find that interesting, especially compared to what Earl said, because Earl said that the focus for him was primarily on the training that he did with the team in Weissach, where it was all about training all of the software models on the car and really working more with the electrical and the sort of data components, the computerized component of it. I figured that somewhere in that there would be a sort of training and logging laps element to it. But he said that for him, the focus was more on the modeling of everything. So it almost sounds like for you that it is a bit more of that traditional keeping sharp and just getting time and experience at tracks and just time behind the wheel sense, is it not?
Yeah, and the reality of it is that I'm very focused in North America, and customer racing is the main focus for PM&A. PAG is where I'm housed as a team member, but the focuses here are working with the clientele, working with our customers, and working with our teams. And so, for instance, Bobby Viglione, who's the head engineer at Wright Motorsports, will have an online session with me and a co-driver where we'll discuss Sebring coming up and go out and do some testing, do some discussions in certain corners. So we're using it much more as a tool and an interactive piece for our customers and for Pro-Am racers. But certainly in the Weissach side of it, and where Earl's talking about it, I mean, that's a seven-figure sim that is like Formula One. It's set up to pre-run setups and to pre-run systems before going testing with the works team. But 18 years in, my role is a little different. I'm not so much on the front line as some of the 20-somethings that you've probably talked to, but like to think that I have as clear and as important of an engagement, just a different role.
I think you make another interesting point that is true with the emphasis on customer racing here in North America and in IMSA, especially in GTD. And you look at some of those teams, obviously the budgets aren't necessarily as big as what you'd find with AG. So I presume then that iRacing plays a more prominent role on the sim side of things when preparing with those teams, because it is a little bit more accessible, but the program's strong enough to where the data acquisition and all those sorts of things that you would go through in a sim, you largely get the same sort of results with iRacing as you would with a lot of the more high-end simulators.
Yeah, absolutely. And the processes of preparing for a race, qualifying and racing, you have that same mental exercise. I can't necessarily tell you that iRacing is a platform to make a driver go faster in a Cup car or faster in a GT3 Cup or GT3R. But what we're using it for is getting a lot of the low-hanging fruit out of the way so that when we get to the track, we're more prepared. We've had those discussions. We've done our track walk, and we can focus on the immediacy of the car running, which is what we're limited by in track time, in the amount of funds available every hour that engine runs, every set of tires. We can get a lot of that done in simulation, much like the aviation industry.
You mentioned a little bit about working with teammates and getting a feel and a flow for how things would work in the same car. I have to imagine that that aspect of it has to play really, really hugely into it, especially when you're preparing for some of the endurance races. That you can get together and run a stint or two on iRacing and get a feel for how two or three drivers would work together, how they would want the car balanced, and the sort of tweaks and bits that you would need to change over the course of 6 or 10 or 12 or 24 hours to make sure everything goes just perfectly.
Yeah, and in reality, sport is a mental game. There's the physical aspect of being able to endure and put up with the G-forces and the cardiovascular intensity of a sport. But when it comes down to it, what makes somebody very good versus one of the elite and one of the best, it's usually the mental processes, the mental approach, the performance thinking mindset. And so we can utilize this platform to exercise that application of how you battle yourself over a lap and not overcook it or not underdo it, how you find the limit, how you, like you said, communicate with your teammates, communicate with your engineers. So much of that is across the board in all sports, and we're lucky that driving translates very well to online simulation.
I would have to think that the endurance end of it is something that you can tackle as well, finding ways to log laps for an extended period of time and making sure that you build up the stamina to where you can crank out consistent laps that keep you top 3, top 4, top of class, depending on how things shake out. I imagine there's got to be a little bit of training on that front too, no?
Absolutely, and the mental focus side of it. If I'm doing 90 minutes on the sim, I'm as mentally, if not more mentally depleted than I would be in a 90-minute stint in the race car. And there are some reasons for that. One being I'm not as comfortable on a sim as I am in a race car. Others is that I have limited senses that I can feed off of in the sim, so I'm overloading those. But in the end, the risk factor of being in simulation, the criticizing ones would say, oh, well, it's not real, you can push the reset button. But actually, when you apply it to the mental side, it's more challenging because you can drift a little bit easier when you're not at 150 miles an hour and you are stagnant and have that same incident, and the race goes on without you. So you learn to keep your focus. And we talk about it in racing. If your mind is thinking about something other than the next corner that's coming up, those are when mistakes happen. That's when your pace falls off. You start thinking about your lower back hurting, your lap times slip. You start thinking about that you left your lights on at home and wonder what my wife and family are up to. You're going to have an incident or you're going to slow down. And so those processes of staying completely engaged in what you're doing and pulling out those last few tenths of a second, they're one for one.
You mentioned a little bit about just the feel and the overloading of different senses. Lawrence talked a lot about the loss of, as he put it, butt feel, the ability to sense the forces acting on the car that allow you to help control it and figure out where you need to point it. Obviously, that's not a part of sim racing in any way, shape, or form more often than not. So how much do you end up overloading those senses, and does it make it maybe even more mentally draining because you're working with your eyes and your ears pretty much exclusively to make sure that you've got the car under control?
Yeah, absolutely. In the end, you go back to what are the tools you have to extract speed, and where do you find speed, and where do you process pushing the limit without going over it. But specifically to the physical side, yes, you don't have the G-forces per se, but it sheds light on what I've been sort of living underneath in the last couple of weeks is the hardware, what your force feedback wheel is, what your pedals, how your pedals are set up, how that's all communicating with the software. So it is very technical in getting all of that right. There are people out there, drivers out there they're doing the same lap times on a $200 sim setup from Walmart. But there are also guys that are driving $1 million simulators at Visoc, for instance, who are finding an edge there. So my point being is, though, like at CXC where I'm at now, working with them on force feedback of the steering wheel and maybe the slip angle of the tire communicating to me through my hands, maybe not through my butt, but through my hands, or the way that I roll off the brake in my modulation and my trailing off. Right now I'm on a hydraulic setup, full tilt-in pedal kit like a race car. And that has pluses and minuses because in the end, it's the computer that's registering the clamp of the pads to the rotors. So you have to make sure that you don't overdo it, But if it's tuned up and right, and we're working with our engineers to have that all right, it can definitely translate more to the race car in how your habits form and what your physical inputs are, but B, get you lap time. I'm heading into some very extreme live TV esports races, and so far I've just been trying not to make a fool of myself, and now I want to try to start getting into the race and racing up front with some of these guys that put in 30, 40 hours a week on the sim.
I noticed that you have been busy over the past few weeks, that you took part in one of the IROC races not too long ago, that I have a feeling it won't be too long before we see you in some of the IMSA races. And it sounds like that the last few weeks have been a mix of both testing equipment and participating in some of the bigger things that iRacing has put together. So how accurate am I in that statement? And what have you been up to the past few weeks?
Yeah, it's busier than ever, and I think that is a byproduct of being a Porsche Factory driver. There's lots of PR and media going on, although it's around results that might be more on the esports side or in iRacing. Certainly, Lufke is a company that I co-founded, and that keeps me very busy. We're producing a book, we're building a rally car, we're getting ready for our show in November. So those things have kept me busy, but in reality, I took a month off. I sort of unplugged from the screens and used the time to be around family and not be in airports. But now it's full throttle into racing. It's everyday testing, communicating with the engineers and the team, and preparing for these upcoming IMSA races, as well as the IROC series, which is live on Fox Sports on Wednesday nights. And so, yeah, it's surreal, the world that we're living in today, but you have to make the best of it. We're competitors. Our partners and our employers expect us to compete and to be out there engaging with the fans. And so it's a different platform. It's an odd time. Our hearts go out to everybody who are on the front lines and who are suffering with the byproduct of health and some family members or immediate problems that they're suffering with. But for us, we're fortunate that we're able to compete as well as be engaged and be focused in racing when there's a lot of tough things going on in the real world.
I think when we look back on this period and it all ends, I have to believe that the perception of sim racing is going to change and that it's going to evolve. And people, I think, are going to respect it a little bit more. Do you have a sense of where it might land, especially on the sports car side, and how much of the data that you're picking up now and all that testing may well actually carry and benefit you and help you, especially in this period where I think we've all seen that sim racing can be a little bit more useful than I think people initially gave it credit for?
Yeah, I think there will be a byproduct of going back to work per se and jumping in airplanes and being at racetracks where simulation won't be as prominent for a lot of us. But in the off season, I think it will. I'll never look at it the same after this point. Diving into the pace that these guys push these cars to online. It's like I said, it's more foreign to me than any racing I've done in a long time. I think I would be more at home in a sprint car in real life compared to a sports car in online racing. And so I have found new processes. I've found new scheduling habits, communication technique, everything that I think I will apply to normal racing. But as far as simulation going forward, yeah, I think you're going to see a lot of evolution, software and hardware. I think you're going to see massive growth in the online community, in the amount of races that are on offer. And I think you'll see a lot of people like the PCA who are going to have more outlets for drivers, more driver online courses, more DE. And hey, maybe we'll be able to race Wednesday nights from the comfort of our own home after a long work day and still travel to the racetrack on the weekends and jump in our real race car. But as we know about motorsports people, they can never get enough. So there's that scary part for me of having a steering wheel in my house in the basement.
Valid points there, and a few that I think are right in line. I would think that the midweek volume of competition would step up. You'll be happy to know that PCA Sim Racing already has an EDE program that they use to great extent on Wednesday nights. And then hopefully more manufacturer and track and series support as well, now that I think they've seen what it can do for a lot of the people that have been in and got in before all this and have gotten a pretty prominent space, like IMSA, like IndyCar, like NASCAR over the past few weeks. Now, in iRacing in particular, you have a few Porsches available. You've got the RSR, the GT3, and the GT4. Have you had the chance to work with those three cars in particular, and are you able to sort of pick out the differences between them and how they compare to the differences between them in real life?
I've sampled the three, but I've been very focused on the RSR. It's only been a couple weeks since I sort of jumped straight into this head first, so I've been trying to keep my surroundings pretty stable. The RSR has a lot of similarities in how the downforce works, the trail braking works, the amount of brake force that you can use. So the maths and the simulation side of what the engineers that Porsche and iRacing have come together to create these cars, it's very cool. The last millimeters and the last feet of braking boards, I tell people that's not what this is about. Again, it's back to the wholesome thinking of competition, of preparing yourself for the race, learning new racetracks, having online races where you're learning about racecraft and biding your time and managing your tires. And so, yeah, I think it's great. I think that the emotional side of it is unbelievable. To have the sense of success, the sense of failure, and challenge, and we all want to be challenged. And so that part of it is super cool, and I think that it bodes well for the next generation. I think the point of entry is a lot cheaper. Barrier of entry is more reasonably managed, and also there's a safety aspect when you are very new to the track where you can start to understand some of the driving dynamics and physics before you get out on the track. But I still think, just going back to the aviation reference, I still think that it's very important that you keep them separate and that you still go into a race car on a racetrack with one mindset versus going into simulation or an online race with another mindset. But there is that practicality of processing and practice, just like when we go into the gym to prepare for motorsport. The way we lift weights, I'm not saying that's the way that you turn the steering wheel, but your sensory motor, your physical, muscular, genetic makeup is tested in all of these different situations.
For our PCA Sim Racing members, and especially since you have so many tips and so many bits and pieces that I think you can offer on the RSR, do you have any recommendations and hints for all of the folks watching as to how you can get the most out of that car and just generally how you can improve your lap time?
Yes, I'm still learning, but what I've learned from Lawrence and some of the guys that are spending a lot more time in this domain is, number one, the first couple laps, survive the first couple laps of a test session or a race, because the tire model doesn't give you nearly as much stability. It's simulating cold tires. So go out in the first couple laps and don't go for your deepest brake zone until the third or fourth lap. Number two, focus on your footwork, just like in real life. The way you attack the brake pedal on the initial hit versus trailing off of the brake pedal, and then your transition to throttle, whether you're a right foot or a left foot braker, it really does matter in simulation, just like in real life. Mashing the brake or mashing the throttle is going to not only have wheel spin and brake lockup byproduct, but it's also going to change the physics and the dynamic of how the car works and the platform of the car and how it works aerodynamically. So yeah, be sensitive. Again, be in tune with your product. Make sure that you have everything sort of in sync and tuned up. And there's a lot of online support for that in making sure that your wheel and screen and pedals are communicating with your computer. And then take it seriously. Try not to have that tow button in overtime use and log laps and chip away at it just like you would in real life.
And then finally, that emotional component that you talked about, there's so much that goes into all this, whether or not it's work on the front end or the back end. The lights have gone out, which I guess we should take to the side.
I'm going to take you on a ride. Oh, there we go.
Oh, we're going to go riding here with Patrick Long around the shop, I guess. But no, in either case, there's so much work that goes into this in the back end. So when you find some sort of success and you come up with a breakthrough in the testing side, or you complete a session, and you know you've got some good lap times in, or you go out and you win a race, how does that emotional component of success and reward compare to what you find in real life?
I mean, candidly, it's probably more extreme right now for me on simulation, because it's a world that I know much less about. I'm much less in my comfort zone, and I'm more the new guy out on the track. I mean, in the IMSA race at WeatherTech Laguna Seca, I was just trying not to screw up the leaders' race as they came around and lapped me. So it is that humbling. So I had a breakthrough yesterday where preparing for Mid-Ohio, I got down into the same second range that the leaders are running in, where I had been a couple seconds off. And so I mean, my mood last night was like I had won Le Mans. I was so content with that result, and that's because it's a lot of work, and it's hard to extract that last 3%. And so, like in anything in life, we want to be challenged, we want to make progress, and we want to succeed. But I'm not sure I have any victories in the next 30 days of my online racing career, at least at the level I've been competing at. But I'm chipping away at it and leaving the ego at the door, and realizing that it is a different sport. And I love analogies. I'd say it's like being a pro tennis player and deciding that you're going to get into a world record level ping pong. Yes, you have a paddle or a racket, and yes, it's one ball and a net, but it's a whole different science, and it's a whole different game. And that means no disrespect to iRacing, but it's just, they'll tell you themselves that it's a different sort of tools. And yes, you have to apply yourself.
Apply yourself, dig yourself, and find that speed some way, somehow. But with work, eventually it all comes together. Pat, thank you so much for your time this evening, and we look forward to seeing you back on track whenever we get the chance to get back on track.
Thanks for having me.